The first case we will be taking a look at today involves a man from Thailand named Apichai Ongwisit. Apichai was born into a family with a dark and violent history. His father, Apichai Ongwisit, was a notorious man in Bangkok, convicted in 1983 for the brutal murder of a 15-year-old girl named Nuan Prang Bnag Chalum. Chai's crime was completely senseless. He killed and dismembered the girl simply because she had tapped on a fish tank at his market, allegedly distressing the fish. His crime and subsequent imprisonment gave his family an unsavory reputation, largely fueled by fear. Despite his father's notoriety, Apichai grew up very comfortably, inheriting significant wealth from his family's business ventures. The family owned a profitable market in Bangkok, which provided a substantial income and a bit of respect from the local community. But as we know, the Ongwisit household had some violent tendencies. From a young age, Apichai exhibited troubling behavior. Those who knew him described him as a disturbed individual with a fondness for violence. He was known to have a volatile temper and a controlling nature, traits that would later manifest in his crimes. Apichai's early brushes with the law included charges of substance abuse and illegal possession of firearms. As an adult, he took over the family's nightclub business in Bangkok. The nightclub became a notorious location, attracting a seedy clientele and becoming a hotbed for illegal activities, including substance dealing and human trafficking. It was within this environment that Apichai's sadistic tendencies flourished. He used his position and wealth to exert control over vulnerable individuals, particularly young women, whom he lured to his property under various pretenses. And I want to emphasize Apichai's family dynamics. His father's crime and the subsequent social stigma that came with it likely had a profound impact on his psyche. Despite their wealth, the family lived under Chai's brutal reputation. If you mix this legacy of violence with Apichai's own psychological issues, you get a toxic combination that leads nowhere but to more suffering. Moreover, violence being a known factor in getting people to listen normalized that behavior for Apichai. The lack of positive role models and the presence of criminal elements in his immediate environment likely contributed to his development into a sadistic criminal. Apichai exhibited characteristics typical of many serial killers: a lack of empathy, a need for control, and a propensity for violence. During adulthood, Apichai's psychological state continued to deteriorate. The thrill of violence and the power it gave him became an addiction. Psychologists believe that similar individuals who derive pleasure from inflicting pain often escalate their behaviors over time. The initial acts of violence become insufficient, leading to more extreme and sadistic actions. In Apichai's case, this escalation took the form of constructing metal caskets designed to imprison and torture his victims. The use of these caskets would go on to become a signature aspect of his crimes. The discovery of Apichai's crimes started with a missing woman named Warrenthorne Chait. In late 2019, her family reported her missing, and suspicions quickly fell on Apichai, who was actually dating the woman at the time. Warrenthorne's family and friends had grown increasingly concerned after she failed to make contact for several days. Their concern was compounded by rumors of Apichai's violent behavior and his controlling nature. In January 2020, police obtained a search warrant for his property in Bangkok. The initial search focused on locating Warrenthorne, but what the authorities found was far more horrifying than they had anticipated. In a shallow grave on the property, they discovered Warrenthorne's body. Her remains were identified by a distinctive fish tattoo on her back. This discovery set off a chain of events revealing the full extent of Apichai's depravity. As the investigation continued, police uncovered more evidence of his crimes. A particularly chilling discovery was made in a pond on his property, where divers found hundreds of human bones. These bones were believed to belong to multiple young women who had gone missing over the years. There were also flesh-eating fish in that pond, which made the scene all the more disturbing. It was clear that the pond was used to dispose of Apichai's victims' bodies. Further searches of the property uncovered metal caskets that Apichai had used to imprison and torture his victims. These caskets were found in various states of disrepair, some with clear signs of having been used to hold human bodies. The investigation also revealed that Apichai had constructed elaborate systems to conceal his crimes. This included secret compartments, hidden rooms, and other sophisticated means of disposing of bodies. Officials determined that the crimes committed were backed by strict and meticulous planning. Apichai typically targeted young, vulnerable women, often luring them to his property with promises of money or a better life. Once they were in his control, he would imprison them, subjecting them to horrific abuse and torture before eventually killing them. Warren Thorne was a perfect target. Her upbringing was pretty normal, like many young women growing up in Thailand. In her early 20s, she moved to Bangkok in search of better opportunities. Like many young women from rural areas, she found work in the city's nightlife industry, becoming a bartender. This job, while often stigmatized, provided her with a way to earn a living and send money back to her family. She faced many hardships during her time there, but nevertheless, she was able to build a life for herself in the city. That's when her path crossed with Apichai, and the two started dating. To Warren Thorne and others, he appeared charming and rich, someone who could provide stability and security. However, this relationship would soon turn into a nightmare. Initially, the relationship seemed like a step in the right direction for Warren Thorne. However, as the relationship progressed, Apichai's controlling and violent tendencies started to surface. He gradually isolated Warren Thorne from her friends and family, exerting more control over her life. Key testimonies from witnesses played a crucial role in the investigation. One of the most important witnesses was Apichai's former security guard. This guard was facing unrelated substance charges, and in return for a more lenient sentence, he revealed Apichai's sadistic actions. He described how Apichai would beat his victims with iron bars, bind their limbs, and force them into metal caskets, where they would remain for hours or even days. The guard's testimony corroborated the physical evidence found on the property and provided insights into Apichai's methods and the extent of his crimes. Other witnesses, including former employees and acquaintances, also came forward with information about Apichai's behavior and activities. On January 18, 2020, Apichai Ongwisit was formally arrested. The arrest was based on the evidence gathered from the search of his property and the testimonies of witnesses. He was initially charged with the murder of Warren Thorne Chayat, unlawful detention, and concealment of a body. Additional charges were expected as the investigation progressed and more evidence was uncovered. Following the arrest, the investigation expanded to include a thorough examination of his business operations and personal connections. The police suspected that Apichai might have had accomplices or that his nightclub could have been a front for other illegal activities, such as human trafficking or substance distribution. Investigators interviewed employees and patrons of Apichai's nightclub, gathering information about his interactions and activities. They also scrutinized financial records, looking for any transactions that could indicate payments to accomplices or the purchase of materials used in the commission of his crimes. In January 2021, Apichai was convicted of multiple charges. The Thai criminal court sentenced him to life imprisonment. Additionally, he was ordered to pay significant financial compensation to the families of his victims. Peter Dupas is one of the most notorious serial killers in Australian history, with his crimes spanning over 3 decades. He was born into an average family in Sydney, New South Wales on July 6, 1953. Despite the seemingly normal suburban environment, Peter's early life showed signs of underlying psychological issues that would later manifest in violent criminal behavior. Details about his family life and childhood are sparse, but it is clear that by the time he reached adolescence, Peter was already exhibiting disturbing tendencies. Peter's first recorded crime occurred in 1968, when he was just 15 years old. He attacked a female neighbor with a knife. The attack was unprovoked, which is obviously alarming for someone so young. This early act of violence led to his first brush with the law and set him on a path of repeated criminal behavior. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, his criminal activities escalated. He was repeatedly arrested and imprisoned for various offenses, including assault. Each time he was released from prison, he quickly reoffended. It was clear that this pattern of behavior was not going to stop. For whatever reason, the judicial system struggled to manage Peter, which led to significant backlash from the public. His attacks were characterized by extreme mutilation, often involving the use of knives. Peter primarily set his sights on those he could easily overpower, meaning he targeted women. He would befriend them, gain their trust, and then attack them. His ability to manipulate both his victims and the authorities is cited as the main reason he was able to evade long-term imprisonment for many years. In 1974, Peter was convicted of his first sexual assault. He had lured a woman to a secluded area under the pretext of needing help and then attacked her. This conviction resulted in a relatively short prison sentence, and upon his release, Peter quickly resumed his crimes. Throughout the 1980s, he was convicted multiple times for sexual assaults, each time receiving prison sentences that failed to deter his behavior. In 1992, Peter was convicted of raping a woman in Melbourne. While his previous crimes had been graphic, it was this attack that truly set the tone for what was to come. Despite his conviction, Peter served only a few years in prison before being released again, highlighting the inadequacies of the system in dealing with repeat offenders. Fast forward to 1999, Peter came into contact with a 28-year-old psychotherapist named Nicole Patterson. Nicole was working in Northcote, Victoria at the time. Her death on April 19th is often regarded as Peter's most horrific murder. He had made multiple phone calls to Patterson in the weeks leading up to her murder, posing as a potential client. He claimed to be seeking counseling for depression and gambling addiction. These phone calls, which were later revealed during the investigation, demonstrated Peter's methodical approach to selecting and isolating his victims. On the day of the murder, he arrived at Patterson's office for his supposed counseling session. Unbeknownst to Patterson, Peter had brought a knife. Upon entering her office, he attacked Patterson, stabbing her multiple times. The brutality of the attack suggested overwhelming rage. Police quickly identified Peter Dupas as a suspect, based on phone records and his history of violent crimes. During a search of his home, investigators found blood-stained clothing, PVC tape, similar to that used at the crime scene, a ski mask, and newspaper clippings about the murder. These items provided critical evidence linking Peter to the crime. Blood found on Peter's clothing matched Patterson's DNA, providing irrefutable proof of his involvement. Before continuing with what happened to Peter, let's take a step back to 1997, when two more women had the unfortunate fate of crossing paths with him. In October 1997, a 40-year-old woman named Margaret Maher was found deceased in Somerton, Victoria. The details of the crime scene were similar to those of Nicole Patterson in 1999. Margaret was a worker known to frequent the Melbourne area. Her friends stated that she had a circle of regular clients, but one night, after exiting a Safeway grocery store in Campbellfield, Peter lured Margaret into a dark alley where he murdered her. When the crime scene was discovered, Margaret's body was found severely mutilated. The investigation into Margaret's murder faced significant challenges. As a sex worker, she was part of a community often marginalized and overlooked by society and law enforcement. It wasn't until 2004 that advancements in forensic technology were able to link her murder to Peter. Then, in November 1997, a 25-year-old woman named Marcina Halvagas was also murdered during a visit to her grandmother's grave in Faulkner Cemetery, Melbourne. Halvagas' body was discovered near her grandmother's grave, surrounded by evidence of a violent struggle. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and abdomen, with wounds suggesting a frenzied attack. Officials were able to gather DNA evidence from the crime scene, but just like with Margaret's murder, Peter wasn't linked to it until 2004. Now back to Nicole's murder. Peter ultimately received a life sentence without the possibility of parole for her killing. This sentence was handed down in August 2000. The judge who issued the ruling emphasized the hopelessness of Peter's rehabilitation and his complete lack of remorse. But honestly, Peter should have received a much harsher punishment much sooner. If that had happened, so many lives could have been saved. The trial for Margaret's murder wasn't held until 2004, during which Peter received another life sentence. Then the trial for Marcina's murder took place in 2007, where he was given yet another life sentence. Back in 2001, Peter attempted to appeal his conviction, arguing that the evidence was insufficient to support a guilty verdict. But the shocking, or maybe not so shocking thing is that Peter may actually be responsible for many more murders that have not yet been tied to him. Many investigators and members of the public are confident that there are more victims who met their end at Peter's hands. A couple of the people Peter may have murdered include Helen McMahon and Rita Brunton. Helen was a 47-year-old woman who was beaten to death in February 1985. According to witnesses, she was sunbathing topless when a man suddenly leaped on top of her and took her life. When authorities arrived at the crime scene, Helen's body had been left completely nude. The location where Helen was murdered was near a beach in Blairgowrie, coincidentally the same area where Peter had previously assaulted a 21-year-old woman. He had served time for that crime, but was later released. In fact, he was on pre-release around the time Helen was murdered. Initially, officials believed Peter was still in prison when Helen was killed, but once they discovered his pre-release status, he was added to the list of suspects. As for Rita, she was murdered in the kitchen of a clothing store at a mall in Sunbury, Victoria in 1993. Rita was stabbed over 100 times. As recently as 2017 to 2018, Peter was confirmed to be tied to additional murders. For example, there was the murder of an elderly woman named Kathleen Downs in December 1997. Kathleen, who was 95 years old, was stabbed to death in a nursing home in Brunswick. Officials later discovered that Peter had actually called the nursing home a short time before Kathleen's death. And here's just one more detail I found after finishing the research for this case. Back in the 1980s, when Peter was being held at Pentridge Prison in Melbourne, he formed a romantic relationship with a nurse working at the prison. Her name was Grace McConnell, and she was about 15 years older than Peter. Then, in 1987, while Peter was still serving time, he and Grace actually got married. During Peter's trial in 2007, Grace was brought in to share insight into what kind of person he was. She was quoted saying, "He insisted that he was in love with me. He said that with my help he could come out of himself and become a normal person. I agreed to marry him, not out of love for this man, but from a sense of responsibility to help him become a useful member of the community. In my mind, our relationship was that of a mother and son. Our life was very basic. I went along with it out of a sense of responsibility. It got to the stage where I could not bear him touching me." She also described Peter as self-obsessed, lazy, dependent, and overall unbearable. And that comment about how she felt like it was a mother and son relationship, but still had sex with him, that was so weird. Obviously, she didn't mean it in a literal sense, but still, why would you say something like that? What do you think? Could Peter Dupas be responsible for even more murders? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a case.